In this video, we will talk about what research ethics is, and we will focus on some key principles in research ethics that you have to be aware of when conducting research for your master thesis. First of all, what do we mean by research ethics? In Norway, all research has to follow some guidelines, and for you, those guidelines will be the guidelines for research ethics in the social sciences, humanities, law, and theology. There are also separate guidelines for other disciplines and research fields. These guidelines have been developed by the Norwegian National Research Ethics Committees, and they outline the researchers' ethical obligations towards individuals and groups that are part of the research project, ethical obligations towards other researchers. That could, for instance, be to reference your sources properly, to avoid plagiarizing sources, etc. Ethical obligations towards funding bodies, I will not talk about in this video because it's not so relevant for most of you. You have to fund your own research. And there are also some ethical obligations towards society at large. And in this video, we will focus on the first point, the ethical obligations towards individuals or groups. How should we treat the people with or on whom we conduct research? Are there activities in which we should or should not engage in our relations with these people? And when we talk about research ethics, we often talk about dilemmas and challenges and ideals and not absolute principles, because there are some do this rules, but these rules often have to be adapted to your specific circumstances. You have to take different issues into consideration. These guidelines are ideals. There are some boundaries that you should not cross over, but within these boundaries, you have to use your own discretion. And research ethics require that you can reflect on the choices that you make and adapt these principles to your specific situation in your research project. But let's start at looking at some of these key principles that you have to follow. Firstly, there's a principle referred to as informed consent. And that means that when a research project deals with personal data, that is information that relates to a person that can be identified, researchers are obliged to inform the participants or subjects of research and to obtain their consent. The consent must be freely given, informed, and in an explicit form. So there's two parts here. First, you have to inform people. What kind of research are they taking part in? And secondly, they have to consent or agree to being part of the research project. The second principle is the principle of confidentiality and anonymization. In the guidelines, it is stated that researchers must process data acquired by personal matters confidentially. And that confidentiality means that you should not reveal information that has been shared between you and the research participants with other people. In qualitative research, complete confidentiality is simply not possible, because in most cases you will share some of the information people share with you. You will publish it as part of your thesis or as part of your journal article, either paraphrasing what people have said or using direct quotes from the research participants. So complete confidentiality is not possible. But you should restrict who can listen to the recording of the interview, who can eavesdrop on you while you're conducting an interview or while you're observing, who can get access to the information that should not have access to this information. And we can ensure the anonymity of research participants. And it says here in the guidelines that personal data must normally be de-identified, while publication and dissemination of the research material must normally be anonymized. So you should make sure that when you publish the research, it is not possible, based on what the informants are saying, whether through quotes or through paraphrasing who your informants are in most cases. There's some exception to this rule, especially if you're interviewing, let's say, public figures. You're interviewing them, the mayor of a certain city. It might be relevant to actually reveal the name of that mayor. But in many cases, people should be made anonymous. The third key principle is to avoid harm to the people participating in your research. That you, as a researcher, you're responsible for ensuring that participants are not exposed to serious physical harm or other severe or unreasonable strain as a result of the research. I'm guessing that in most cases, the research that you will be conducting for your master thesis, you will not be exposing your research participants to serious physical harm. But there might be a situation where that could be a danger. That if someone else in the community gets to know that these people are participating in your research, maybe there will be some consequences for your research participants. And it is then your responsibility as a researcher to think through whether that can be the case or not. There's also other kinds of harm that can arise in a qualitative research project. You participating in the research could cause stress for the research participant. Maybe it can hurt their career prospects, their employment opportunities if they reveal information that later becomes disadvantageous for them. If you break confidentiality or you reveal their identity, maybe that will cause your research participants to get into trouble later on. Maybe harm could be to damage their self-esteem, damage their future opportunities in some way or other. And you should think through, before you embark on the data collection, whether your research could in some way cause harm to participants. And there are quite a few challenges here involved in how to deal with research participants who, for instance, start crying during an interview. Would that be considered causing harm to research participants? Is that something that you could foresee before you actually started the interview? Could you have avoided it? Can you ensure that such a situation does not arise? Or is that something that you would not be able to foresee? Because qualitative research builds on trust and a relationship that develops between the researcher and the research participants. And especially if you're doing research on more sensitive or personal issues, you have to think through, what if people reveal information that they afterwards regret revealing to you? What if they say yes to being interviewed and then later on it becomes difficult to say no to answering a specific question, even if they actually do not want to answer that question? What if your participants reveal information that's sensitive, that deals with other people who have not consented to being part of the research? So there's quite a few potential challenges here. The fourth principle is to be specifically cautious when you are doing research on vulnerable groups. Because then you have a special responsibility to respect the interests of these groups. That could be marginalized groups in society, but children and young people are also considered specifically vulnerable, and they have the right to extra protection when they take part in research. And one specific way that this extra protection of children and young people is made visible is that they is in terms of how you deal with informed consent when you are doing research with children and young people. When a child has turned 15, they can usually consent themselves, and you do not need to get the consent of the parents or the guardians of the child. If the child is under the age of 15, you have to obtain consent from parents or guardians, in addition to the consent of the child, him or herself. But if you are doing research that involves asking more sensitive questions, for instance about religion, then you also need the consent of the parents or guardians, even if the child is above 15. Lastly, these research ethical principles, they appear at different stages of the research process. Some principles are relevant throughout the research. Some principles become more important to think about at a certain stage of the research project. When you are designing the research project, formulating your research questions, deciding what kind of methods to use, you have to think in particular about what kind of groups are you, or individuals or groups are you doing research on? Could they be considered vulnerable in some way? Would you be collecting data on more personal or sensitive issues? And then you would need to take some extra precautions. When you are collecting the data, you need to think about informed consent. You need to think about how to store the data that you are collecting. We'll talk more about that in a future video. And you need to talk about the power relations between you as a researcher and the people involved in your research. And we'll also bring up this issue later on in a future video. When you're analyzing the data, there's also some extra consideration that needs to be taken into how you transcribe the data and how you analyze it. How do you deal with the fact that your analysis of the data and your analysis of what people are saying or what people are doing might not be the same as their own interpretation of their own life world, their own sayings, their own views. How do you make clear to the reader, and this comes into the last point when you're publishing your research and writing it down, how do you make clear to the reader when you are presenting your analysis or your perspective versus when you are presenting the research participants' own perspectives, their more insider, emic perspective on the issue at hand. So this was the first video on key principles in research ethics, and then the next video will look into some of the dilemmas that might arise as we try to apply these principles to real life research.